To keep up with today's increasing production demands, growers are quickly realizing traditional fertilizers are coming up short. Beyond a single form of sulfur, MicroEssentials with Fusion technology delivers sulfate and elemental sulfur for season-long availability. Early in the growing season, sulfate sulfur provides young plants the nutrition needed for optimal growth. But plants dependent on sulfate sulfur alone are left vulnerable to the yield-robbing impact of leaching. But MicroEssentials is very different. Over time, microbes in the soil more efficiently convert the elemental sulfur into sulfate, continuously supplying the crop throughout the entire season and beyond. Only MicroEssentials with Fusion technology delivers season-long sulfur for steady nutrition throughout the growing cycle, resulting in higher yields and higher profitability.
Our next forum here. We've had beautiful weather for our first day here at Big Iron and some great sessions. Appreciate you joining in, not only here at the show itself, but you can find us online. We've got yourliveevent.com. It's also streaming on the Red River Farm Network YouTube channel.
An hour.
Why don't you guys... appreciate moving the conversation out there, if you would. I would say we're getting into a subject talking about land values, what's happening in rental rates, those kind of things. A lot of times there's a lot of questions people want to raise a hand on. If I can, Tyler, why don't you come up here? In that bag, they've got notepads.
Terry, can you hand those out, Terry? We never got really to them. Terry will hand them out.
There you go.
We'll put Terry to work.
Perfect. Hand those out, and that'd be a good place to ask questions as well. But we also have a microphone that's around here as we move forward as well. The title of this session is called Mixed Messages, Tight Margins, and Strong Land Prices. And I think that's been the enigma in this market. This land value's held up pretty good considering some of the drop-off we've seen in farm economics as of late. We want to find out where it's going, and that's what our discussion point is for our panel today. Again, all the good folks from Farmers National Company. We appreciate that. Let me just introduce, first of all, Kyle Nelson with us. You're right here in the Fargo office. Appraiser, farm manager, work on real estate sales as well. Yep. Jim Ivers making the trip from Grand Forks, right?
Yep.
Farm management.
In real estate.
And Troy Swede with us, area sales manager on the real estate side, farm manager with Farmers National Company since 2010, right?
Yep, correct.
You in Sioux Falls?
30 miles south of Sioux Falls in Beresford, right between Beresford and Sioux City.
Okay, perfect. Great to have you make the trip north for the Big Iron Farm Show. Great to have you here. Let's talk about this land market first of all. We talked about it earlier on the day, Kyle, when we had you on the airwaves. I asked you how you described this year, and you had one word that came top of mind.
Well, I'm going to add an adjective to that, but I'm going to say remarkably resilient. A year ago, I made the comment that I think the bloom is off the rose, meaning that we're kind of hit a peak, and I was wrong. So despite the higher interest rates and the commodity prices, we've really seen surprisingly strong prices. I think especially if you take out the outliers, 'cause we had some really strong sales. So far, it's looking like a fairly steady market in many cases. There again, it depends on what it is, where it is, but we're seeing very confident and resilient results thus far.
Troy, I'm curious from your perspective, how would you assess this land market, big iron time here?
You know, realistically, I think we kind of thought the land value was going to soften up quite a bit as we moved into 2024. We knew demand is still staying relatively high, but with commodity, you know, the decrease in commodity prices, the increase in interest rates, the stock market's doing well. Maybe thought a little bit of the outside market was going to kind of step away from the land, but when you take a look at what we've seen on the land sale side of things have stayed extremely strong, almost surprisingly so in a lot of times. So I think it really comes down to location and quality when it comes down to a lot of these products that are selling. If you have a farm where, you know, it's got some problems with it, it's got some wet spots, it's kind of cut up, it's in a low demand area, you're probably finding that down that maybe 10%. But if it's a really good farm in a high demand area, it's selling almost the way it was 12 months ago.
We've seen a lot of inventory at this point. What's that situation?
In some areas, yeah, and I think that's going to be a key is supply, because even though we say it's kind of staying strong, resilient, I mean, it's going to depend on the supply. So for the most part, I haven't seen an oversupply in too many areas, but we could see that, because especially, we've talked about in this session before, in a presidential election year, you get people thinking a certain way. So I think, you know, we're going to see, you know, people that want to have a sale and close it before the end of the calendar year. So my anticipation is we'll see a bit of a rush here in this calendar year. And then, you know, who knows in 2025.
It seems like we were at a time when you guys were busy year round. Has that changed any in this environment?
Well, we're busy year round.
Regardless.
Right,
But I mean, the number of land sales.
I would say, you know, land sales, we always just say the peak time is maybe now through April. Certainly technology has changed that with bidding online and, you know, opening it up to just about any time of year. But you have to read what's going on in a certain time. So like right now, for example, I mean, with commodity prices, especially over the summer, having dropped as much as they have, in my opinion, I think I've been trying to time stuff till harvest comes in, or, you know, a little later, but that's just my opinion. It always depends on the circumstances, what it is, where it is.
We've seen a steady supply of product for sale or farms for sale over the months, but when you talk about, to go back, you talk about inventory, I think if people aren't here looking to buy a farm, I think I would be stepping up and probably trying to get it identified and bought. You know, when you look at 22 to 23, national inventories are down 20 to 26% across the board as we move from 22 to 23 to 23 to 24. As we move into 24 to 25, I don't see that really jumping back up. I think inventories are going to stay relatively tight, or farms that are coming to the market. You know, that might change if we see a big change in, you know, some sort of recession in the ag sector. Some guys are forced to sell some farms, but I think inventories are going to stay tight, which is going to keep those prices up there. If we do see that flood of inventory, it's going to obviously put pressure on price. But, you know, the people that we're talking for, and they're looking and they're actively trying to buy a farm, I think I would be jumping on that and getting it bought.
Kind of look, there's certain areas where there maybe is a lot of ground up for sale versus others. At least that's anecdotally what my feel would be.
Yeah, I was just talking to somebody this morning. There's a lot in Norman County, just to the northeast of us here. So we'll see if there's if the market absorbs that, you know. But we're still, I've used the term in the last few years, it's an opportunity market. There's still, I think the buyers are, you know, I was just talking a few hours ago, you know, whether it was 9,000 or 11,000, they want it, it's the opportunity, it's right there. In the end, yeah, in either case, it's more than you want to pay, but it's the opportunity. So that's been a driver that I see in the last 2 years. It's not about a deal, it's the opportunity.
Tim, what's your assessment when you look at this?
Yeah, I think the inventories have been down compared to 2-3 years ago. Not significantly, but a little bit. And I think that's what's helping keep the market as strong as it is. I think if we get, like Kyle said, if we get a large run in a certain area, that could could depress that, but again, it's, location is everything, and if it's a quarter across from your house and that's up for sale, you know, do you want to sit there and watch someone else farm it for the next 40, 50 years?
Yeah. Those opportunities don't come up very often, right? In that last session, we talked a lot about the interest rates. How big of an impact has that had, Troy, as you take a look at the land market? And how do you see it moving forward?
You know, I'm not going to speculate on what I think interest prices are going to do, but, you know, to go back, I really thought it was going to have a lot bigger effect on the land values than it did. You know, when you take a look at, you know, these guys and run the numbers as well as anybody, you know, but you take a look 2 years ago, you're financing a lot of these farms at 3, you know, the first number is probably 3, maybe somewhere in the low 4s, you know, now you're looking at upper 6s, maybe to low 7s. But it hasn't really affected the land values all that terribly much. Even the same with commodity prices. I mean, I thought it would have probably affected more than it did. Obviously, it's eating into the profitability of the farmers and the capability of buying some of these farms, but there's still just a lot of money out in this marketplace still. There's still a lot of outside investors looking to get in the ag sector that it's obviously affected, but not near to the level I probably thought it would.
Are we still seeing the number of investors that we've had in the past, or what's that environment?
I don't think so, but,
I
you
think-
know, if the interest rates come down, like some are anticipating, I mean, that brings a few more of them back, but everyone's got a different MO. I mean, I can't speak for Troy or Jim, but the ones I tend to deal with, they're buyers no matter what. I mean, they're in the market, they're in the know. There are some that are in and they're not that knowledgeable, and it's, you know, diversification for them. So I guess my sense is the number is a little lower, but that's my experience.
I think, you know, and again, sorry, I think the numbers, I think it's really flat. You know what I mean? When I take a look at like this, those type of investor markets are there all the time. So if you guys are attending one of our land sales or a competitor's land sales, you're going to have online auctions and you're going to have people on the phone. They might say we're having phone bidders, we have online or simulcast auctions. There's always those online bidders that are there, and basically they're there to keep everybody honest, and they're looking for a deal. When you take a look at nationally, 71% of the farm ground still gets purchased by local landowners. So they're not buying a high percentage of that, but they're always there, again, to make sure that no big deals are coming into place, because they're not particularly bought into generally that particular quarter. They want to buy something where the ROI kind of makes sense in that general area. If they can find it, they're always going to be kind of looking at all the time.
We've been kind of toying around with it, but are you seeing any no sales, any weak sales, any of that happening?
We haven't, to my knowledge around here, I think, I was just talking to one of our auctioneers in Iowa. There's been a fair amount, I don't know if you have.
We've seen them, not so many up in this particular area, when I would say called the northern region, which I would work in. I'm the sales manager for South Dakota, North Dakota, Western Minnesota. We haven't seen much in our area yet. We have seen maybe a slight shift in how some of those properties are getting sold. So if we're maybe looking at selling Kyle's farm and it's got some blemishes on it, it's not that perfect quarter, it might not do well at auction. So we're seeing maybe that we're going to put that onto a more like a traditional listing. And we're going to put that price out there. So maybe our strategies have maybe changed on some of those properties, but.
I think in Iowa, when you're talking $20,000, $30,000 an acre, you know, where there was a few sales like that, you know, those are big numbers. So, you know, that's where interest rates maybe did have a little more of effect, because that's, you know, 7% or whatever on that kind of money is a lot more money. But I think I've noticed through the years, they're slower to adjust their expectations there. So that might be part of it there. But I agree with Roy. Auction isn't always the optimal method to sell something, perhaps. I mean, it depends on what the market. You don't obviously, intrinsic to an auction, you have to have more than one person motivated to buy it. Sometimes that buyer pool is a little thinner, so then you look at other marketing opportunities, listing it, or some kind of a bid process, what have you.
Jim?
Yeah, I was just going to kind of parrot that. You know, the property really determines the best sale method. And, you know, probably the three main ones we use are the auction, conventional listing, sealed bids. And it really depends on your particular property on which one markets the best. I've had really good luck on some sealed bid sales that were less than prime property that would not have brought the same in an auction.
Farmers National, you refer to it as it's a national company, obviously. You get the benefit, I would think, of seeing what is happening in different parts of the country. How would you assess what's happening in the Northern Plains, Upper Midwest versus what you're seeing in other parts of the U.S.?
I think we're about the same. You know, when we take a look at it, our inventories are down, our prices are kind of flat to maybe slightly softer depending on the property. I think they're seeing that nationally across all farm ground. I think demand for farm ground still remains high, especially in South Dakota. When you take a look at the beet acres in Red River Valley, I mean, the beet prices are going to help support some of those. You know, we talk about, you know, right before this, I started talking about the big crop that we've got coming in. We're going to see that across the Dakotas and western Minnesota, or western North Dakota. We're going to see this big crop. There's going to be a lot of bushels to deal with come fall. I think that's still going to support real well towards land prices.
I'm curious, if I can switch over kind of the rental market, what's happening there? Are we seeing any trends? Is that following what we're seeing in the land market?
You know, what we've been seeing, or I've been seeing, at least in the northern area, is that the rental rates have been, you know, they've been strong, and we're not seeing much room for an increase. We're looking mostly at flat rates if you're already in the market. If you're coming off a 3-year lease that might be below market, there might be some room there. But and then if you're on a higher end, top of the market lease, there's definitely going to be pressure for that to come down a little bit. But all in all, I would say that we're looking at pretty much a steady, flat rental rate going into next year.
Yeah, I would agree with Jim. You know, we're just getting into our leasing season as we're talking about what are we going to do with the farms that we manage for 2025. And I mean, when you look at lease types in the Dakotas and Minnesota, predominantly we're cash rent historically up in those areas. You know, so unless you're coming off a 3-year lease, you know, then they were below market. Yeah, we might see a bump in that, but we're not seeing a reduction in rents. You know, I get phone calls from neighbors and farmers that know that we're in this business. They're asking me, hey, your rent's going to come down for 2025. I just don't see that as of yet. There's maybe a couple really outliers where you might start seeing some of that, and that's on very rarely, but every once in a while we put our property out for bids. And maybe you guys would rent something out for bids, or your farms got put out for bids 2 years ago back in 22, 23. And their tenant overpaid that market by $30 an acre just to get his foot in the door. Yeah, there's probably gonna be some pressure on those. But if you're cash rent, when you're talking to your tenants and you're in a very fair environment, or you think your cash rent is in that realm of fair, I don't think we're gonna see adjustment on those for next year.
I think compared to our last super cycle, or whatever you want to call it, 10 years ago, where the rents just shot through the roof to adjust to commodity prices, I think this last cycle, I think at least as far as we're concerned, and the other farm managers that I know, that I talk to with other, I think the increase was more conservative. So right now we're at a point where it's more of a soft landing, and I don't know, I can only speculate that was part of the thought process all along.
And it's, you know, a lot of it is based on crop insurance prices. You know, right. as you know, back then, you know, we take a look at the spring crop insurance price, I think it was $461 on corn. You know, so we're dealing with that number to deal with for most farmers as they finish out 2024, because we're already below crop insurance prices the way they are. So I don't think, you know, if we're going to see a lag in cash rents, maybe in 2025, that's if we set that March crop insurance price at, say, $4 or $3.90. If it happened to come in 50, 60 cents less than it did in 2024, yeah, then I think we're going to have this conversation of what 12 months from now when we're sitting across, we might be having a different story. But as of right now, I think we're telling our clients, I mean, told the line, I think we're not going to have a problem getting those renewed at the same rents.
Does this downturn in commodity prices, how does that factor in as we go through that negotiation process in leases? Has it?
Oh, it absolutely does. And I mean, you know, the people who are sitting here, a lot of you guys are probably landowners yourselves. They're going to have conversations with your tenants, and that's what they're going to be talking to you guys about. You know, they're going to be talking about, hey, my input prices are up, interests are up, you know, but at the same point in time, we want to sit and talk about, all right, but input prices have come down quite a bit, almost 40% from 22 to 23 to it is now, and interest rates are starting to soften up. I know that's still a big factor for all the farmers to deal with. But I take a look at land values. It's hard for land values, it's hard for rental values to come down 15% or 20% like your tenants might be asking for when we haven't seen that 15 to 20% reduction in land values. So as landowners, your expenses keep going up every year too. Your taxes, everything that you're paying is going up every year. So when your asset hasn't decreased in value, it's hard for us to justify a decrease in rent.
I think another major factor is that we're sitting on a huge crop for most of the state. And there are pockets where they were not as well, and those we might actually see some.
Yeah.
Yeah, but mostly the bushels are there to kind of compensate for the lower markets. So that's you know, a tool that we look at also.
Heard you say 3 years when we talk about leases. That pretty much the most common term we're talking about on a lease agreement?
You know, we used to do, you know, 10 years ago, I would say almost all of our leases were 3 years. And then we kind of ran into that buzzsaw of 2012 when the prices just skyrocketed. So we've seen them 3-year leases. For a while, we really drew that back. But we're looking more, I think probably my most common lease is a 2-year lease now.
I think industry-wise, you know, 1 to 3 is the norm. Long-term leases are generally always best for the tenant, never for the landowner. So we always advise away from long-term leases. You know, there's nothing wrong with a 3-year lease. The biggest thing that I would recommend if anyone's considering a lease more than 1 year in length, even in, I guess I would recommend it on every lease that you're doing regardless of length, is putting a flex provision in there. You know, they were, I would say, relatively new 10 years ago, but they're almost the norm now. We're running on this on probably 60 to 70% of the leases that we do. And basically, excuse my mic, the flex rents are basically, we would still collect what we consider a fair rent in March. And then we take it to, and there's 100 different equations you could find online on flex rents. You have to take the yield off the property, which is easy to get, you get from your tenant, and then you come up with the price. And when you come up with this price, you can either use, some people use the average. I use the average of the spring price for corn, the fall price. That comes up with a number times a percentage. And if your base cash rent was 150, and you put it in that equation, and it says, and it comes out at 175, we know that that tenant is going to owe us a $25 bonus check. So that does protect us if you guys get into a 3-year lease and commodity prices just take off. Some world-shed moment takes place, Russia invades Ukraine again, something globally happens and we see corn price go to $8, and now you're stuck in a 3-year lease saying, oh, well, now my base cash rent's way too low. If you've got that flex in place, it's going to help take care of that for you.
And Troy's, when he was talking about the spring, fall, he was talking about, you're talking about the crop insurance price.
Yeah, correct, yeah.
So I'm curious if there is an existing lease on that particular piece of ground, does that have impact on its marketability?
Depends on what that lease says. But, I mean, certainly when the market's strong, we've seen a lot more land marketed publicly that had certainly a year's lease. I sold a piece a little over a year ago down in Lemoore County that had a year lease. Obviously, it was way below market, half market rent. It's at the record in Lemoore County. But as, you know, things tighten up, it becomes more of an issue. Certainly once you start getting into multiple years, it can have more of an issue. And then you start dealing with other issues. First right of refusal is something that's come up. And that can be very problematic, because what that is that's giving somebody else, a third party, probably the tenant, the right to match any offer. And that's a whole nother can of worms.
Yeah. Ideally, you would like it not to have, you know, in a perfect world, it wouldn't have a lease on it, but It's something that gets dealt with, and again, it's, the piece of property too will decide how much tolerance there is for waiting a year.
I think almost anything attached to the farm has the opportunity to be negative. You know, whether or not it's a lease attached to the acres, or it's some sort of easement attached to the acres, or some sort of right-of-way issues attached to the acres. As soon as you attach anything to the property, I think you open yourself for a negative. Like Kyle said, obviously, it really depends on the lease type you're on. And sometimes in a lot of things, it depends on your buyer. If it's your local farmer buyer next door wants to buy the land, he wants to farm it. He doesn't want to see his neighbor out there farming it. But if it's one of those 30% of the farms that get sold by a local investor or a corporate investor, you know, they're looking at ROI. If the ROI makes sense, they maybe don't necessarily care who the tenant is on the property.
I look at this, myself included, the buyer, or the age of that farmer is aging. We're looking at the boomer generation. I'm curious, I guess, when we start looking 5, 10 years down the road, like who is the buyer on some of this farm ground? Is that, you guys look at some of that more longer term dynamic?
Well, I see it in areas I feel that are continued strong even to today, or where there are next generation farmers. So, and they're not starting from scratch on their own. They have the benefit of, you know, a preceding generation that perhaps is helping them out in some way. But, you know, they figure you've got 30 years to pay for that. So they're likely to be more aggressive. And certainly there's pockets where there's an absence of that. And if you're 60 years old and you've got a decent land base, how motivated and you don't have a succeeding generation, I mean, how motivated are you to, you know, buy a quarter for $1 million, for example? So that's what I see right now influencing the strength or lack thereof in certain areas.
You know, I don't know who our buyers are going to look like in 10 to 15 years, but I can tell you there's going to be a bunch of them. When you take a look at, if I had my PowerPoints up here, I could show you a graph, but the baby boomers are going to start dying off. So our death rate of people is really going to be a lot higher over the next 10 to 15 years than it has been in the previous 10 to 15 years. It's just because of the age of the baby boomers. So when we take a look at it, we estimate around 40% of all farm ground is going to get sold in the next 15 to 20 years. That equates to about 140 million acres. So I don't know who the buyers are going to be, but there's going to be a lot of sales that are going to have to come up, or at least a lot of farm ground is going to start changing hands in a lot of different ways coming up in the next 2 decades.
Well, we're sitting here, FM diversion is part of the conversation. What impact has that, or does it have an impact on?
I will say it did not have the effect that we thought. There was an effect, but it was behind the scenes. You know, I know many sales we had, or I observed, I thought that would be more of an impact. And I'm not saying it was an impact, but I think there was other strong influences at play in many of those cases. So I think the biggest impact on that kind of thing with the diversion is residential and rural residential and those kinds of acreages. We've seen that just go crazy. Certainly any 30-mile radius of Fargo-Moorhead, but even outside. I mean, I've seen in certain areas, you know, what a farmstead with nothing special, modest 50 to 100-year-old house and modest outbuildings, what those are bringing, even with the high interest rates, that is what really floors me. I think, obviously in those cases, some of those buyers have a lot of cash.
I was just going to interrupt. I know we got a smaller group in here today, but I'm not a professional speaker by nature. If you guys got questions, if something triggers in your mind, you can either write it down or heck, just raise your hand at any given time. We'll call on you, because I just want to keep this completely casual as we move through this. So if Kyle says something you want to follow up question on, just raise your hand. We'll stop at any time.
I actually have a question right here. You guys were talking about as the baby boomer generation moves on and there's going to be a lot more available land for purchase, is there any thought or consideration or concern to institutional purchases over, you know, more private entities making purchases?
I guess probably not from me. I mean, I can't really speculate on who those buyers are going to be, how they're going to hold those types of properties. When you take a look at like how they're holding the properties, we're seeing most of it is going into trusts. Is probably the most common way. Again, I have another number is if you go back to like 1982, 9% of all the farm ground was held in trust. Right now, that number is about 25% of all farm grounds held in trust. It's just
What was that number?
We went from like 1982 to like 2024, we went from 9% of the farm ground held in trust, or 2%, excuse me, to almost 25%.
I'll address that. I mean, because I get a bunch of that, you know, people don't want China buying their land or Bill Gates buying their land. And I mean, those are overblown concerns in my experience, in my opinion. I think ultimately it's the neighboring farm operation that has the most motivation to acquire that land. Not saying those influences don't have factors, but I hear that all the time, and I just tend to.
And foreign ownership is less than like 2%.
Yeah.
And when we take a look at what foreign ownership is, the biggest holders of it, you'll see is like on the Maine has a big area that's highlighted, northern Montana, Minnesota, excuse me, Montana. And a lot of that's logging coming out of Canada. And they're taking trees, they're owning it for logging purposes. So we're not desperately concerned about foreign ownership.
We're at the front side of sugar beet season. We've got pre-pile that's going on right now. I think a year ago at this point, we already had some sales happening in beet stock. Has anything happened in that arena?
To my knowledge, there's not. I just checked yesterday and today. I think somebody has some listed for $58.50 a share. As I understand, that's roughly where they ended up last year. I'm gonna guess there's a bit of a wait and see on that. I know on some of the other co-op stocks, there's more demand than supply. There's just not a lot of supply. People are holding on to it and whatnot. But certainly, I mean, I've talked to 2 growers in the last 2 days that have 30 plus tons already. And one of those was a month ago he was digging, and it was 30 plus tons. And another farmer I was talking to, that he was digging his low spots and his poor spots. So, I mean, we could have a huge beet crop. So that's looking like the saving grace as far as profitability in the Red River Valley goes this year. So that, as it pertains to land values, that's certainly a factor. And in my mind, that's certainly a factor in timing. Like if I was having a sale.
You guys involved in stock on like the ethanol plants too, or?
Yeah, none of us handle that directly, but yeah, those are still, it's a supply and demand issue. There's demand, there's not much supply, and there's not a lot moving. That's as I understand it. It's kind of in balance. And still, you know, Golden Growers is one common around here, and then a bunch of, you know, the ethanol plants are all kind of staying steady to strong.
You walk around these grounds and you see, obviously, a lot of tiling companies that are here, and I feel like we've seen a lot that has gone on here in the last 10 plus years. If you're you know, a non-farming type landowner, does that make sense to be looking at having that type of drainage on your ground?
Dealt with any, Jim?
You know, my opinion is drainage is always good. And I think, you know, drain tile's been going in left and right. And I think part of that has to do with the strong land market. You may not be able to buy another quarter, but you can improve what you already have. And that is, you know, they've shown and proved tiling does pay for itself in about a 5 to 7 year payback time.
And that's right, about 5 to 7 years. You know, when you take a look at, you know, eastern North Dakota can get really wet. I'm from southeast South Dakota. Southeast South Dakota can get extremely wet. You know, we go by the mindset, you buy it and you dry it. You know, so I mean, we want to own the ground and then turn tile on it as fast as possible. And it's something that goes down to the economics of it. We need to do a lot better job of probably raising a bigger crop on the acres that we have. It's maybe not feasible to go out and buy that extra quarter, but maybe let's start raising an extra 40, 50 bushel an acre on the farms that we have. So we work with a lot of tiling projects on the farms that we manage.
If you're an absentee landowner, it depends on what your objective is. Is it just to improve the land, and is it the long term? Great. If you're looking for immediate payoff in terms of added value or extra rate of return, it's probably not going to pay for itself in this area, because in this area, of course, we're talking pattern tile, probably with a pump. You're talking at, you know, $1,000, $1,200, $1,300 an acre. Where you do see a payoff immediately is you get into the more longer term corn belt, like let's say in central Minnesota, where you don't need a pattern tile. You've got selective tiling here and there. There, I have seen it, I mean, it more than pays for itself immediately in terms of value alone. And that's not even counting added rent. So that's what I see. I'm always an advocate of tile, just that in the Red River Valley where we have such an expense from an absentee landowner standpoint, it may not necessarily make direct, immediate economic sense.
We've been talking about that good productive crop land. I'm curious what's happening in the recreational type of ground that we have out there. Has been any change in those trends?
Through the roof.
Really?
And I would say as of a year ago, I think that's a supply and demand issue. There has not been a lot of supply. So, and just like we say with farmland, with recreational land,
Is there
where-
certain
What's on it? Does it have water running through it? Does it got hills? Is it hunting, fishing? You know, those properties, the more boxes you tick off, the more value people find in it.
And I think it comes down to where your location is from, population centers. I mean, a good hunting property closer to Fargo is worth a lot more than something in central North Dakota. So, I mean, if you're close to a population center and you've got good wildlife activity there, there's definitely value there.
woods definitely is what people want. Waterfowl, I just don't see driving recreational market. And like I said, location. Cheyenne Valley, south of Fargo, has just been coveted. We didn't have any sale, anything available for sale for years, and last marketing period there was several sales that were $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 an acre for zero income or minimal income. Maybe you can run a few cows out there. So when you're talking $800,000, $900,000 for a piece to hunt on, that's mind blowing to me.
The economy sounds better than I thought when I hear some of those conversations. You're hearing the same thing, Troy, in South Dakota and some of those areas?
And regarding hunting?
Yeah.
Yeah, when you're in South Dakota, we're talking pheasants. That's what everything we're talking about, bird hunting. So you've got a piece of property that's got CRP on it, and you're looking at CRP in central South Dakota, your tax on that land is probably $12, $14 an acre. You'll have hunters that'll give you more than that, just have access to go out and hunt it. So it'll pay your property taxes in central South Dakota. That's just on hunting leases. Then selling it, there's still a lot of value there to sell it as well.
So what factors are buyers looking at when they're making land decisions?
Location.
Oh,
quality. And, soil, I always make my spiel about productivity indexes, and, those can be overblown, over relied upon, but, if the buyers are looking at those, and that's a factor of the market.
I had this conversation with one of our appraisals, and we maybe don't see eye to eye on it exactly, but I look at it as if I was an outside investor and buyer, and this is again just my opinion, I would look for the lower quality stuff. When I take a look at it, to be honest, farmers are always willing to overpay for low quality farm ground. Music, for example, like in southeast South Dakota where I'm from, you can go buy a $12,000 an acre farm and turn around and get $325 an acre cash rent on it. It's a great property to have. It'll always be a great property to have. But farmers are always over willing to pay for poor quality farm ground. So you can go turn around and go buy a $7,000 an acre farm ground, probably get $260 an acre cash rent out of it. So your ROI is almost double on that poor quality farm ground. So then you come down in the argument, which one's a better own long time? Are you going to, the better farm is always going to be increase in value probably faster and quicker and hold its value better. But as long as farmers are buying that lower quality farm ground and willing to overpay for that, a lot of the investors I've worked with over the years, that's what they're looking for, the higher ROI and probably the mid-range or lower quality farm grounds.
You don't want poor.
No,
and I don't think that's what you mean.
I think you're talking more of the medium quality.
On a scale of 1 to 10, I'm talking about these 5s.
Well, I think we have a greater ability to improve that ground too.
Yeah.
With drain tile and just better seed varieties, and that we can grow corn on soil types that you never would have thought of 20, 30 years ago.
Has there been any change in value in, say, some of the infrastructure, farm buildings, grain bins, those kind of things?
I think what I see, and when I analyze them as an appraiser, I've seen some sales of buildings that I think you could, and it would depend on what you figure the land is worth, that you could probably build it for what it went for, which is usually farm buildings go for pennies on the dollar. 50% just right off the top, and it all comes down to what it costs to build today. The cost of that has escalated so much. I'd say especially for shops, with not that long ago, I'd use 50 or 60 bucks a square foot for a shop. Well, I've seen the specs and price sheets for a couple of shops lately, and they're $100. Now, they're pretty nice shops. They're not what maybe the hobbyists would build on their farms. So I think that's a big part of it. And certainly grain storage. Because as the previous session, I mean, that could pay for itself. You know, the marketing opportunities it gives you. So.
Especially as we've seen corn move farther north, as the producers get into the corn, they realize they've got a lot of bushels to do something with, and the storage come after that, and so we're seeing quite a bit of storage out there.
But there again, utility comes into play. If an old crib or an old 40-year-old elevator from a small town, I mean, it just rarely do you see that bringing much money. It's just more of a headache. You know, I can only speculate, but the modern utility is key. And so, you know, there's the other thing too, when you talk about a grain facility, the size of that. I mean, if you start talking, I've seen several, you know, if it's a $500,000 or 500,000 bushel facility or more than that, and you don't have many farmers that are in the mix for that, and you may or may not have a local elevator that's in the mix for that. So size has a factor of that.
I guess the obvious question is, has this land market peaked? What are your thoughts there?
I think it's peaked for now. I mean, I think it maybe peaked, you know, a year ago, you know, coming off of like in the, you know, December of 23 or, you know, January 24 was maybe kind of in that time frame before we started softening it up. But I mean, I say it's for now. I mean, when you take a look at what land values have done, I mean, we have your dips and valleys forever, but I mean, I think it averages like 2.2% annually, and we generally go up on farm ground. So historically, it's going to tell me is our land values are here, but I mean, 10 years down the road, we're going to be here. It's a matter of how we get there.
So what should this group be looking at when they're looking at the factors, key factors on this land market going forward? Anything that should be top of mind?
Well, we always think the fundamentals, interest rates, commodity prices, but what's been happening has defied those, really. So, you know, I guess if you're a farmer, I mean, I guess it's just opportunity. What's that opportunity worth to you? You know, and that's a personal decision with anyone. I deal with a few people that are always in the market and looking for deals, and I guess there you have to educate yourself on where some of those opportunities can be. And I always, you know, as a salesperson, I always want people paying attention to every sale. Like, don't pawn it off like, oh, everything's going too high, it's going to go too high. Because certainly I've seen cases where it kind of fell through the cracks. You know, everyone just assumes so-and-so was going to be interested, or that person would be interested. And for whatever reason, they're not. They're not in the mix. And, you know, things can fall through the cracks. And certainly in today's online auction environment, you have that opportunity at your convenience. You don't have to spend several hours or half a day traveling to an auction. You can watch it on your phone or your iPad. And I've certainly had clients that I deal with call me up and they're like watching something. It's like, should I be looking at this? And, you know.
Yeah. And they might be in the combine at the time doing it too.
Yeah.
Technology has changed, hasn't it?
So there's that opportunity to pay attention. And I've certainly had some pieces where I call people, just say, hey, pay attention to this. Don't forget about it. It might, you know, be worth paying attention.
I think you were talking about people in the crowd. I mean, I would go by and, you know, like the gentleman over there, if I was talking to him earlier, and, you know, I'm sitting here today because I'm maybe thinking about selling my farm, you know, in the next 1 to 3 years. We haven't really decided yet, but our lease is just terminated. Might be a good time to sell the property. I think if your time frame right now and you're thinking you're going to sell in the next 1 to 2 to 3 years, I think I'd be selling this year. I think there's more indications are that land values are probably going to be a little bit weaker as we move into 2025. After that, I'm not even going to come close to speculating what land values are going to do, but there probably says we've maybe hit the target for a peak for a while. Because again, if you take a look at like that graph, excuse me, I keep on snagging here. But if you take a look at that graph on land values, I mean, we kept these valleys and then we kind of shoot up and then we have a valley. We've got to plateau a little bit for 2 to 3 years, and then we have a new red. We plateau for 2 years. We escalate, plateau for 2 or 3 years. You know, I think we're on to that. We've already hit the top, so it tells me that we're probably going to plateau. If history is going to repeat itself, we're going to see probably flat to slightly lower prices before we have that next trigger event. When that's going to take place, I don't know, but I think if you're thinking about selling, I think I would be pulling the trigger.
And there's a lot of unknowns out there too on the political front. What am I think, the
Capital
exemptions.
Capital
The
gains.
capital gains tax, that's a big one. But the, was it $12 million estate
The
exempt?
estates, that's gonna drop to 6.75.
Yep.
Go from 13 to 6.75.
If it doesn't get renewed. And so that's, that's a factor. And that's something, if you're looking at selling your land, you want to have a plan, you want to talk to your attorney, your accountant, and get those things answered up front and see if this is, this is a good time to sell.
Yeah.
Have a good idea what your tax consequences are. And we defer that.
Yep.
Talk to your attorney or accountant.
Yeah.
I think people want to have maybe some one-on-one time with you guys. Any takeaway message for our group here today?
I think what happens going forward is going to depend on supply in any given area. Apart from the obvious, commodity prices, interest rates, those will always affect things one way or the other, but I think this year it's going to be supply, the amount of land on the market.
Jim?
It always seems like, well, you never see what the next event's going to be.
Right.
And you don't know when it's going to happen. I mean, like you mentioned, another invasion of Ukraine, invasion someplace else. You just don't know. So, and that's always been farming. You never know when the perfect time is. You'll never hit it.
Yeah.
So it's good to have a plan, a succession plan or a tax plan when dealing with distributing your assets out. And I think that's kind of the takeaway. Just think about it, get it planned out, and execute.
Your thoughts, Troy?
I guess I would stay positive. I mean, there's still a lot of good things that can happen in this market. Land values are holding strong. Like Kyle used right off the bat, used the word resiliency. So if you're landowners, you're holding on to a great asset. Treasure that asset, protect it. So stay positive with that. We're circling, trying to recap a little bit of everything, not to take up all your time, but cash rent values are still holding strong. So, I mean, that your ROI is going to be really, really good. Commodity prices, we don't know what's going to happen with that. Historically, during presidential election years, we generally see from January 2nd to the high of a year, like $1.53 on corn, and from January 2nd to the high of the year in soybeans, it's $2.89. So historically, it says we're going to rally into an election year. We just rallied corn, 30, 40 cents here a couple weeks ago. Maybe we're seeing some of that now, but there's still a chance commodity prices are going to come back and really keep this market strong as we move into 25.
I know Farmers National, you guys got a lot of resources. Where can folks go to find that, and where are you guys located here at the show?
We're in the beef barn, right over there.
Building L.
Building L. There's no beef in there right now.
Okay.
We're in the
We're
in the middle aisle, right in the middle.
Yeah,
Probably the hottest part in the barn.
Yeah.
That's where we're at.
Yeah, right in the middle.
Yeah, finding.
You're in sales, aren't you?
Really finding us is, go online, go to farmersnational.com. You're going to find all of our information right on there. We've got offices in Grand Forks. We've got one right here in Fargo. You could stop by while you're still in town. We've got agents that are spread out all over South Dakota, North Dakota, and central Minnesota. So we're pretty easy to find. But yeah, look us up on the internet or give us a call. Like Kyle, I'll gladly give you his home phone number. You can call him anytime. That's not an issue with me.
They're not hard to find.
Yeah. Well, we got a question right out front before we wrap up here.
I said I was born in 1946, March, so it sounds like baby boomers. I'm all washed up, right?
Well, the piece of land I sold in Lemoore County a year ago that was set a record high, that gentleman was well into his 90s. So you got a lot of years left.
Yeah, I'm glad you're here. Thank you. Well, again, check these guys out. We appreciate guys being here, and remember they're back here at 2:30 tomorrow. If you want to check them out, you can find them on our live stream or our YouTube channel after the show as well. You can always go back and refer to any questions that you might have. Again, my thanks to Kyle, to Jim, and to Troy for being here today. Why don't you show your appreciation to these guys?
To keep up with today's increasing production demands, growers are quickly realizing traditional fertilizers are coming up short. Beyond a single form of sulfur, MicroEssentials with Fusion technology delivers sulfate and elemental sulfur for season-long availability. Early in the growing season, sulfate sulfur provides young plants the nutrition needed for optimal growth. But plants dependent on sulfate sulfur alone are left vulnerable to the yield-robbing impact of leaching. But MicroEssentials is very different. Over time, microbes in the soil more efficiently convert the elemental sulfur into sulfate, continuously supplying the crop throughout the entire season and beyond. Only MicroEssentials with fusion technology delivers season-long sulfur for steady nutrition throughout the growing cycle.